Okay, let's officially get started with a recording. Hello, everybody. We're so excited to welcome to you today's special class. Today is the Civil Rights Movement, the Warren Court, and Landmark Civil Rights Laws. My name is Kerry Sautner, and I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And we are so excited that on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we get to have a conversation about the larger civil rights movement, the amazing work of King, the amazing work of so many people that fought for freedom through struggling from the 1600s on and all the way through, changing laws, changing the Constitution, and changing the legacy of freedom for all of us. We're going to share with you great links to partners in the chat, and we're going to dive into this history. And I'll let you know now, we are doing a brief overview of this history because it's huge. So we really just want to spark your energy, spark your brain, and have you dive in deeper. One key thing that I just heard from the King Center, I was just listening to their production of MLK Jr. Day, and one of the things they said was that Martin Luther King Jr. used his voice and his spirit to lift all the voices for freedom, a collective belief that was passed on through ancestors, through the people of America, and move forward to allow us to take over and to keep moving freedom forward. And I just thought it was a beautiful statement about how this man used his voice and his skills and his abilities to bring us all together, but also pulled from the past and the amazing work of people before him and gave you and all of us the baton to keep moving forward freedom, because a democracy takes energy of its people. And that means us, that means we the people. So without further ado, and I know we have so much to go over today, I'm going to be joined by Nick Mosvick, who is an expert in this. He's one of our senior fellows. Nick, would you like to say hello to everybody?
Hello, and I think you've given us enough of an introduction, so we'll keep going.
Let's go, Nick. Okay, so we've got a lot of big ideas around this freedom, but do you want to give us a synopsis or jump into the big questions? We're going to focus tightly on the civil rights movement and the law that was changed, but maybe some big ideas of the whole piece that you would like our students to pay attention to.
Yeah, and we'll get into those when we look over kind of the big questions. But I think the idea here is to start by taking a step back, because we will get into the civil rights movement, which broadly we're talking about the period of the 1950s into the end of the 1960s. But we're trying to show how we even get there. First off, that there is a civil rights movement that goes back much further. As we'll mention, for instance, right after the Declaration of Independence, abolitionists led by African Americans are already petitioning for not only freedom, but abolitionism of slavery. So that's an early movement. And there's civil rights movements by that name in the Reconstruction period in the early 1900s. So the push for civil rights acts is not something that happens just in the 1950s. Rather, it's a series of events, of people, of ideas that come together to produce the factors, right, historically, that allow these things to happen. In other words, it's not inevitable. It happens because there are both the right people, but also the right things going on in terms of society, right? Because we'll talk about, there's migration of people, there's World War II, there's the generally changing minds of the American people towards supporting things like desegregation, but that, of course, is also a result of the ideas that the civil rights movement is pushing. So it goes back and forth, right? The point is here, there's a lot going on, and there's a deep history here. We could spend a lot of time talking about just the 19th century. We could talk about African American leaders and the abolitionist movement and in the post-war movement. And so there's a larger history at play here, and I think that's the important thing to keep in mind, that all builds up to the moment we get, which roughly we kind of think of Brown versus Board, and then the civil rights movement takes over, because court victories aren't enough to ultimately win the battle.
So, and I think that's important for our students to understand, because if you just think of the civil rights movement from 1950s and 1960s, it's not just one moment in time. There's all this leading up to it and all these things that happen after of it. And the civil rights movement is major change that happens. It doesn't make sense if it's in isolation. It makes total sense when you see it as a continuing through line of the freedom movement. And Professor Jeffries is going to be with us on Friday, and he really teaches this big picture. But let's begin with our Declaration of Independence and walk really quickly through this idea that it starts with this document, and then it's making sure that this document lives up to the statements and the promises that it has made.
Well, I think we can say that pretty simply and quickly, right? Which is to say, anytime we read this now, you're going to be struck by the same thing people were struck at the time, which is this language is really broad. It's universal. All men are created equal. Of course, women would argue to be included, but I think that was part because they thought they were included already. The point is, we're saying all people are created equal by their creator with natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those words immediately were going to ring the bell of liberty and freedom for everybody, right? And so this is part of what historians of the revolution argue over, is to the degree to which that revolution was radical. We mean in the sense that it broke down existing hierarchies and challenged the existing order by the very nature of the ideals within its founding documents. That one right shown there. And so it's not surprising that nearly 2 centuries later, those words are still being invoked by King and others to push for greater equality.
And then the next kind of big chunking of like documents and words basis on we the people, this idea. So we're walking you really quickly through some American history, and we're going to get to the groups that move the civil rights movement forward, and then we're going to break down these from World War I on.
Yeah, just say popular sovereignty, we the people, therefore we're all included. We just read the Declaration of Independence. We the people is the people, we're part of the people, therefore we need a voice. We need to be part of this government by the people, this democracy, right? So that's really what you're getting at. That core claim to being part of democracy is that equality, which, by the way, as we'll talk about it, really fixates on the right to vote, right? The right to participate in the democracy. It's not merely the vote itself, but the meaning of the vote, which is participating within the democratic people.
And then at the end of the Civil War, we have big changes to the Constitution to, again, take that promise of the Declaration and put it into the Constitution. And that's 13th, 14th, and 15th. I know we're going to get to these later, but do you want to just kind of say how this sets the stage? Not for changes to happen right away, but for the ability for the law to come through for all people.
Yeah, I think that the important thing is that what the amendments do, and we've talked about this before in terms of why the amendments matter, is this idea that it wasn't enough to just pass civil rights laws, right? Because laws could be changed. As soon as some Southerners, some former Confederates possibly got political power again, they would reverse the tide. That was always the fear, and that fear, of course, turned out to be true. So amendments were thought to be the long-term solution because they would be permanently fixed in the Constitution, and therefore African Americans could use them to protect themselves against invidious discrimination, particularly the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, Privileges or Immunities Clause, and the Due Process Clause, but also the 15th Amendment. Because they had enforcement clauses, as we've often mentioned. It gave Congress the power to enforce those rights and obligations within those 3 amendments. And so we'll see that, again, about a century later, that turns out to be rather important. Congress did use those powers up till 1875, in particular in the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which was actually drafted by Charles Sumner before he died, and then passed in honor of him, the great abolitionist and senator from Massachusetts. And that outlawed discrimination in public accommodations, parks, fairs, places like that. And it was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1883. We'll see that part of that history is that the Supreme Court also takes an active role in that period and drawing back some of the efforts by Congress in this short period of Reconstruction to really put teeth into those amendments, into the meaning of that equality that's been guaranteed.
Awesome. Okay, so now let's meet some of the, so Professor Jeffries has this way of teaching, and you guys, if you can join Friday, that would be great, but I'm going to steal this from him and just give him full credit. he talks about the civil rights movement of the 1940s through the 60s as when you look up in the night sky and you see stars in the night sky. Some are, that's what we're looking at, the civil rights movement across our country. Some are glowing more than others, but they're across the entire country. But the thing that I loved about the way he explained it, he said, what connects those stars from one town to the other town are these amazing civil rights and civil liberties organizations. And they are across time, but have so much power. And that's when you start to see the constellation. That's when you see, the hunter, all those pieces. And that's how this kind of is a big picture way of looking at it. So let's meet some of those organizations, the NAACP. So we're going to walk through them really quickly, meet some of the people, and then dive into how this energy moves even stronger in the 1900s.
Yeah, and I'll just mention very briefly that it's worth noting that those organizations were built up starting at the end of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century. The Black churches we'll talk about in particular was a vehicle for change and organization, but also Black newspapers, Black abolitionist societies, and so on, right? So they were building up their own cultural institutions over a long period of time. But this is kind of the fruits of that coming together even stronger, right? Because the NAACP was actually the product of previous organizations and a movement called the Niagara Movement that started in 1905. W.E.B. Du Bois was a Black intellectual. He actually was a historian as well who wrote on Reconstruction. Really, frankly, his work on Reconstruction in the 1930s changed a lot of minds in terms of the understanding of the agency of African Americans in that period. So he was a guiding intellectual force, and he joined, as you can see, you'll say, oh, Moorfield Stoley, Mary White Ovington, these are white allies. I think what's interesting about some of the white allies who helped form the NAACP is a lot of them were Jewish intellectuals. Some of them even socialists who were very particularly interested in coming together to fight against discrimination, right? So in other words, you get these coalitions, right? So just think about it that way too. So it's these larger coalitions, who's interested in the fight for equality on a broader level who can also come together. We see that with the NAACP. Very quickly after they form, they already start putting together a legal strategy to challenge these acts of segregation we know as Jim Crow laws. So that starts very early. So, and then here we're starting to get close to the period we know. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is formed in 1957. It's formed before a movement known as it's the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom, which actually is the first time they go to the Lincoln Memorial and give a series of speeches. 6 years before the I Have a Dream speech, King is out there giving a speech. It's called Give Us the Ballot, which is a claim to African Americans need a ballot because if they can vote, if they have that true power of democracy, we'll get rid of Jim Crow. We'll get rid of these recalcitrant judges and other people who are holding back the tide of freedom. And he's joined by a lot of allies. Many of them have a similar background to King in ministry, including Ralph Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth. Ella Baker, as you see here, she was an important organizer throughout the movement. She had a huge role in forming another organization we'll talk about, which is the Students' Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. When we get to that, yeah, sorry, skipping ahead. Yes, that's the same Ella Baker. So she's involved in the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the SNCC. So she's got involvement all over the place, and she's fighting for an equal role for women in the movement as well. So we'll highlight that as a background that there are more men in leadership roles, and that's generally true. And Ella Baker is one of the women who is fighting against what she sees as sexism, even within the movement. So for a greater role for those voices. The Congress of Racial Equality, that's formed in 1942. So we'll note that during World War II, yes, the movement is very much alive and active and forming important institutions that will have a major role 2 decades later in the 1960s, including CORE, as it was known. CORE, for instance, would have a major role in what are known as the Freedom Rides in 1961. And James Farmer himself was, of course, a very important individual throughout this period. And he joined King in many of those numerous meetings with President Kennedy and President Johnson. So we like think of this, right, as it's not just King, but it's these major allies who are going with him to discuss, to get this legislation going. Well, CORE is a big group in pushing for that legislative change. And so is the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. Roy Wilkins is a major leader within the NAACP himself, who had been a former editor of the NAACP's magazine. A. Philip Randolph was a longtime labor organizer going back to the 1920s, the largest Black union in the country, which you don't need to know what these specific kinds of railroads are just to say that this largest Black union, they're railroad workers fighting for their rights. Randolph is a major organizer and a member of the NAACP. But he also helps to organize the March on Washington in 1963. So he's a figure who's been around for literally decades, but he still has an influential voice in the 1960s. So it's important to recognize those founding figures. And then I mentioned the SNCC. I think there's a couple things here. One is to realize a lot of these people were young. These were college students who formed this movement, the sit-in movement in 1960, across the South and really across the country. These sit-ins everywhere, as we'll talk about what that actually meant. But these are 20, 21-year-old kids who are willingly putting their lives in danger, and not only doing that, but also they're putting together a philosophy. They're following nonviolence, but they're also doing it their own way. And they have a very powerful role throughout the 1960s. I'm sure many of you will recognize John Lewis, but we'll talk about Diane Nash and Stokely Carmichael, I think, a lot as well. But that's just to recognize, right, that we have some very old leaders and we have some very young leaders. It cuts across the age divide.
Age divide, gender divide across the country. And one thing, and I'm going to move us really quickly back into World War I time period, but I know, like, we wanted to explain the difference between a fight and a struggle and a movement. And so when we think about African Americans fighting and pushing the struggle forward for freedom, this happens from the beginning of our country all the way through. So Prince Hall is a great example of it. We want you to dive deep into the petitions that were his petitions that were read in Congress to end enslavement, to end the slave trade, all these pieces. But then we really quickly jump up to the Civil War. Then we add the 13th, end slavery, except involuntary servitude, and gives Congress power to act.
Yes. Then
the 14th Amendment, Equality Amendment, and gives Congress more power to act. And then the 15th Amendment, you can see my theme here, voting rights for African American males cannot be denied, and the power to act. So we really quickly get this boom of civil rights happening after the 13th, the 14th, and around the 15th Amendment, and these big first votes. And this, what our other scholar in residence says all the time, we love Tom Donnelly, always says this amazing, beautiful moment in interracial democracy. It's working in this 1860, 65, 67, 77 time period. We get this boom, and then we get a huge pullback. And I think one of the reasons why I speed you guys through this really quickly is not just to get to the ebbs and flows, but when we think about freedom, when we think about justice over the course of time, we know that it's a lot more of zigzags, of movements forwards and huge steps back and movement forward. And it just doesn't happen on its own. It's because people, like this gentleman here, they're fighting for their freedom. And they always did, even when there may be no end in sight for their freedom to be achieved in their lifetime, in their child's lifetime. But it didn't stop Americans from fighting for their freedom and African Americans fighting for their freedom. So bring us to this 1870s, I'm going to get the year wrong, 1867 time period, and then let's jump to World War I.
Yeah, I mean, we can do it quick, but I think maybe the most important thing to say is that yes, this is it's frankly it's an even briefer time period because of course in 1865 the Black Codes are passed, and what's required to enforce Black rights in the South, especially and Black voting, is the presence of the military Reconstruction, which goes on from 1867 to 1877 and many former Confederate states. And it's the presence of those military governors in the military itself that makes it that the largest African American vote is in 1868, not in 1870 after the passage of the 15th Amendment, but in 1868 when they vote for President Grant, in the former war hero, into office. And the Grant administration initially is for the very much in favor of backing these rights. And we talk about some of the acts, the Civil Rights Acts of 1870, 1871, and 1875. They destroy the Ku Klux Klan. They enforce these rights vigorously in the South. Federal prosecutors do so with the Grant administration's backing. But eventually, most of the country loses their taste for this continuous energy to enforce these rights vigorously. Other issues take over. And when other issues take over, it leaves room for the regrowth of this, of white supremacy in the South, of racial terrorism and other activities. And
Yeah,
which eventually leads us to Jim Crow, right? And I said the Supreme Court had a role too, right? And I want to say that briefly. We're not talking about the cases, but the point is we can't leave that out because they actively minimize the, if you kind of just think of it as levels, right? Is that those three amendments are supposed to set a baseline and then Congress can act on that. But the Supreme Court kind of pushed down that baseline, which actually made it easier for states to do more to actively suppress civil rights. So kind of
and one might say
way,
that
right?
Yeah, that the push towards unequality, like removing equality, was always there. It's just people were holding it at bay.
Yes.
And when they let go, it came back out because we didn't change the structure of these systems. It's still able to do that. And you're right, and the courts had a hand in that. So I know we have like 8 minutes left of class, so I'm gonna fast forward us to the
let's just say briefly that, look, the NAACP had a strategy. It took decades. Many different challenges at the Supreme Court level. The Scottsboro boys, this was in 1932. There were 9 boys who were charged with a capital crime of rape, and the Supreme Court overturned that conviction because they had inadequate counsel, which was a Sixth Amendment violation. But the point is, it was a major victory for the NAACP. It wasn't the only one. They had overturned things like the grandfather clauses, racial zoning. In the 1940s, what we call the all-white primary. We don't have to go into what that is, but that was a victory. And then by 1948, I think Shelley versus Kramer is the first real big victory for the NAACP because it gets rid of what are known as racial covenants. All that really means is within a neighborhood's planning, basically, they restrict property owners from selling to certain people. So it's a restrictive covenant, meaning you can't sell to African Americans in this particular neighborhood. And the Supreme Court struck that down as a violation of the 14th Amendment in 1948. And even before Brown versus Board, the NAACP won a couple other victories for law schools and graduate schools to end discrimination at the college and graduate school level. Before they even got to Brown. So the point is this was a long campaign. They worked on this for decades. Thurgood Marshall and his allies started in 1936. So you think how long they're going at this and pushing this strategy is decades. And they, of course, ultimately win Brown versus Board, but it's not the end there. It's not the end either for their legal strategy, which there's of course going to be continuous strategies backed by the NAACP, but for the civil rights movement, because as I said at the beginning, because the South resists Brown versus Board and the desegregation of public schools so heavily and violently, It not only requires the Supreme Court to act further, it requires this, the civil rights movement to step in to do more to push Congress to act. And I think the only other thing to say is we talked about with World War I and then with World War II, you see these veterans, right? These African Americans who go fight in the war. 1919 sees the height of racial violence in what's known as the Red Summer, race riots throughout the country. Something that students can freely look up if they want to, and discover that race riots didn't just happen in the South, but also happened in cities like Detroit and I believe Philadelphia, but also Chicago, Washington, D.C. This was not merely a Southern problem, right? The strife of segregation, de facto or de jure segregation, was a problem in many places.
So when we're looking at the civil rights movement, when we're looking at segregation, we have to understand that there's some direct that we can see in the Jim Crow laws and indirect, that's the de facto. And so this makes it a north to south and east to west issue. There's LA riots, the Watts riots, you can look up as well. So I know there's a lot to kind of jump through here. Nick, where do you want to jump to next? Where do you think
I think we should go ahead and jump to the big things that happen in the civil rights movement, some of the big ideas, some of the big events, big people. I know.
Shall we start with Rosa and not just about the bus?
I never intended to do so because we know Rosa Parks was a member of the NAACP going back to 1943. She was in fact a secretary for the Montgomery chapter, which was a big deal for an African-American woman at the time. And so she was involved for a long period of time. Her husband was actually involved in the pledge drive for the Scottsboro boys back in 1932 when they first got married. So in other words, Rosa Parks was someone who had been involved in the civil rights movement for over 2 decades before she sat on that seat reserved for whites only on a bus in Montgomery in 1955. And the thing is, this was a planned boycott. She just wasn't just tired and sat down and decided, today's the day. No, this was planned. She had something to do with that, but the organization had something to do with that. This was a planned boycott. Why Montgomery? Because it was one of the most heavily segregated cities in the country. That's the reason why King and others targeted this particular place, like they would target Birmingham in Mississippi. They were looking to go to the places that had the harshest laws, because under this idea of nonviolent direct action, which we can talk about CORE really starting a commitment in 1942 to this idea that referenced Gandhi's actions in India, but going back to Henry David Thoreau and others. But the basic idea is they would expose the violence inherent in the system, that in order to carry out segregation and racism and discrimination, it required not only the actions of the state, but private actors and violent actions in order to continue the subjugation. And so if you went into the most heavily segregated places, you could expose for everybody the ugliness underneath. And so that's what they were trying to do, right? So that was the idea of the bus boycott in Montgomery. Why Montgomery? Why a bus? And the same thing with the sit-in movement, right? Is you see here at Greensboro, where it got started in North Carolina in February 1960 by these students. And they would go into these pharmacies that had sit-down lunch counters. That's why they called them a sit-in. And they would sit in areas they weren't supposed to. And white mobs would form around them. They would hit them. They would yell at them. They would threaten them. All these types of things. But the idea was to sit there and expose that violence, because they also knew that they would be photographed. There would be cameras there. There would be video. And it would expose what was necessary. And in Nashville in particular, with Diane Nash and other leaders, there were arrests, but then there was pressure from the population on the mayor to finally do something. He finally desegregated lunch counters in Nashville because he was under pressure, because people saw how ugly and violent it got and how quickly it did. And people weren't comfortable with that, right? And so in other words, that was the success of that style, right? Was something like what the students did in Nashville, in Greensboro and other sit-ins, right? Which was I think a very powerful example of what nonviolent direct action looked like.
And I think, and I've just, Daga said this in the chat, like Rosa wasn't the first one to sit on the bus. Yes, two things. Like Nick said, that wasn't the only thing Rosa did. She did years before and years after. I mean, unbelievable, like how she kept going. And she wasn't the first to sit on the bus. And when you watch the sit-ins, when you watch the freedom rides, you know, this is happening from the 40s on. And it's really this energy around our country in World War I and World War II, trying to find what we believe freedom is, not just in the world, but in our own country as well, for our own people. And it's a million strikes, a million people sitting at the counter, never being talked about, never being put in a newspaper, a million people dealing with the violence towards them and their families, sitting on buses over and over and over again. And this energy that goes to making change is just overwhelming at times, but also this is why I always say this is the class that I cry in, because just the power of people to stay the course, to fight for freedom for all of us is just, we're also grateful for that.
We should use the freedom rides as an example, because just quickly as an example, because this is another example of the nonviolent action. This is in 1961. So at this point, the Supreme Court in multiple decisions has said that segregation in interstate buses is unconstitutional. And so they say, okay, well, in order to force that, to force southern states to change, we're going to get on buses from DC and go into the Deep South. And we're going to expose what they're going to do. We know that they're going to try to stop us. And they did. When they got to Alabama, the KKK showed up. They stopped 2 buses and they firebombed 1 bus. They tried to keep people from getting out of the bus. They managed to do so because the highway patrol showed up. But they firebombed and burned this bus. It was a very scary moment. If you go to any of these civil rights museums, you can see this. But the resolution remained there to continue with these freedom rides, because I think part of it was that moment, which was photographed incredibly, right? Exposed that. And you showed us James Meredith. That's 1962, the University of Mississippi. He's the first to be admitted to a segregated school, this university in the deep, deep South. And he has to do through with the backing of the NAACP too. He has to sue because he's he's a veteran. He's more than qualified to go to the school. But the Mississippi's governor is trying to, he refuses. He says, well, I'm never going to desegregate. And it requires President Kennedy to not only send out federal troops, but federalize the Mississippi National Guard, because rioting breaks out. 2 people are in fact killed by guards because of how violent things got when Meredith first showed up to register on campus. So that was.
And I think, yeah, and I just think this goes back to your point, the duly elected governor. And
Yes.
so you can't have a governor lead you if you don't have the right to vote. If you don't have the ability and you're blocked from voting, then you don't have the ability to get rid of that governor to make these things change. And so when we think about it, like what stopped, it's not just one guy or one person or one law. It is a systematic change for voting rights, for freedom rights, for all these constant pushes to make that change so you can get rid of that governor, but also.
And it's Meredith who did it himself. He read up and he individually said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get into University of Mississippi. I'm going to make this happen. It was a lot on him as an individual to say that I'm going to put up with this, and he put up with it for a year, constant harassment. He had to be a student still with people who very much did not want him to be there, and he did that. He graduated. And as I say, he never left. He's still very much around. And then the March on Washington, which I mentioned at the beginning, we can't not mention this for a couple of reasons, which is one, look, this is an organizational push. Why the March on Washington? It's the push for legislation. It's really, initially, it's organized around the push for jobs, as you can see, Jobs for Us Now, but it also becomes a push for a major civil rights legislation. 1963 is a very eventful year. Unfortunately, we couldn't quite talk about all that happens in 1963, but there's a lot of violence against civil rights workers. There's the bombing of the 4 little girls in Birmingham. That will happen just a month later. But so they organize here, and of course, this is where Martin Luther King Jr. gives his I Have a Dream speech. But the reason we want to talk about that is the content of that speech, in which he refers to not only the founding documents, but he refers to them as what he calls a promissory note. And a promissory note, that sounds like a fancy term, but all he's really trying to say is, look, we made these founding documents this promise of equality for all this time ago. And we African Americans have held on to that. But we want to cash that in. We want to cashier that note. We want that guarantee now. We want that equality now. We want you to live up to these founding documents and what they guarantee. And I think that's a lot like what Frederick Douglass did in 1852 when he challenged an audience in Rochester, New York on the 4th of July. Because he was doing the same thing. He was saying, I read the Constitution, I read the Declaration of Independence. These are great, glorious liberty documents that guarantee equality to all, but you haven't lived up to them. And so what is King saying? We have to do this now. What does that look like, right? It looks like that push for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which, as I mentioned, kind of looks a little bit like the 1875 Act. It's about public accommodations. What do we mean? We mean hotels, we mean restaurants, we mean all those basic things that everybody wants to be able to go to that would be normal to travel, right? Day-to-day life going throughout the country. It also includes Title VII, which will become important later on because that includes the word sex in it, guarantee equality for not just race discrimination on the basis of race, but discrimination on the basis of sex. Well, it's all in that one Civil Rights Act, which will be upheld by the Supreme Court very quickly in a series of acts dealing with restaurant discrimination and hotel discrimination. And they'll uphold that on the basis of the interstate commerce power, which is to say that it's not actually just about the 14th Amendment, it's also about other powers of Congress to freely regulate these things.
And this act happened in 1964, and then we end the poll tax, which is a payment to vote, with the 24th Amendment. And then, remember, it feels like an upswing at this moment, but there's still unbelievable violence. So March of 1965, you have Bloody Sunday, which is one of the most violent interactions between the police and the civil rights movement. And that is Congressman John Lewis right there. He is leading this walk. I think he's 25 years old at the time. People reference the fact that he's wearing a backpack. In his mind, he knows he's going to be arrested. What he doesn't realize is the unbelievable violence that happens next. And I know we're wrapping up really quickly, so I'm just walking us through. Then the Voting Rights Act.
Well, just to say that they're there because they're pushing for voting rights. Because they have the Civil Rights Act, but they say that's not enough. Because yes, that guarantees more equality. Yes, that's a victory. But we still can't vote. We still don't have enough protection. We have 20% African Americans registered to vote. So 1964 is all about this, becomes this massive drive, this freedom summer, as they call it, for voter registration for the 1964 elections. And it's not successful enough. There's so much violence against civil rights. We're talking about murders, 37 churches bombed, I think. We're talking about all this violence and rejection of it. So why are they there in March 1965? Because they're trying, because King, Lewis, and others, the civil rights movement, say we have to do this. We have to expose this violence once more to the public because we have to force a Voting Rights Act. We have to do something else. And they do.
And then we get the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we don't want to leave you, and we have to wrap up, but we don't want to leave you in 1965 and say, and we got this and it's over and it's done and all is good. We want to leave you with a few things. We want you to look at more current cases and the connections between the Voting Rights Act. So Nick, what is a more current case that references the Voting Rights Act of 1965?
So I assume you're talking about Shelby County versus Holder, which is a 2013 case. And the big deal here is, so the Voting Rights Act is partially based on the 15th Amendment, the enforcement clause. And in it is something called preclearance, which the basic idea here is that it gives Congress the right to force states to change their laws under certain formulas, right? If they discriminate too heavily, essentially. And the Supreme Court got rid of some of those requirements because the formula hadn't been updated in over 4 decades in 2013. So that means for some people, there is still a push for more robust guarantee of voting rights, or even possibly an amendment that would give a universal guarantee of voting right. We often say this, but it's worth repeating, which is, we mentioned the 15th Amendment. There's, of course, other amendments that deal with the right to vote, but none of them actually guarantee federally a right to vote.
So as we wrap up class, we know that this was just almost like a little sprinkling of everything that goes on, and we bulleted you through this really, really quickly. Remember, we will send out all the tools that we have. We're going to dive deeper at 2 o'clock into a deeper level and more details about this. But when we think of this time period of the civil rights movement, remember that there are thousands of people who have fought for this, and names that we never hear of, like Bayard Rustin, like Franny Lou Hammer, like all these amazing names and people, and thousands of names.
Document, we just didn't get to them.
We got
Read
to
the document, they're in
there.
there.
But there's also thousands of people who fought for these freedoms that we will never know their names. So we do this class as a quick overview, just so you can see kind of the overall structure of it and walk away with the understanding that these are amazing people who fought for our freedom, but it does take the energy of all of us, of we the people, to continue to bend that arc of the moral arc of the universe, as Martin Luther King Jr. likes to say, towards justice. We need to bend it. And that means the work on us as well. So Nick, thank you so much for the speed class on all of this. And everybody, we will send you that document, and we will hold after class for a couple great questions from Jenny's son, as well as Iman. So 1 second, and I'm going to stop. But thank you all so much, and happy Martin Luther King Day.